Hello everyone. And unlike the previous speaker, right now I'm going to talk about high-level incentives, like why would people create and share creative and how creative content on Swarm-based social media platform. So there's currently a project called Be Free in development, which is a separate project from Swarm, but we're working in close cooperation. It is going to be a library of components from which you can create social media applications. And in this presentation, I'm going to explore how consumers and creators, which sometimes overlap, of creative content will be able to cooperate. And I also would like to leave plenty of time for a Q&A so that this presentation is a bit more interactive. So I would like to have a chronological overview of how the incentivization of creative content has been done in the past, is done in the present, and how it might be done in the future. And so the kind of solutions that we have today, I put it in quotes because they are getting increasingly inadequate for the kind of technology that we're using. So one of the primary tools of financing creative content currently is copyright. It has one very important role that we would like to carry over to the kind of decentralized systems that we're building, and that is attribution. So copyright prevents, or at least seeks to prevent, plagiarism, which is taking credit for other people's work and reaping the various benefits of being the original author. And I believe that given the blockchain and given the kind of primitives that Swarm has, which are actually very similar to Git for those of you who are doing software development, so you can actually, you will have a much more fine-grained and much more reliable way of attributing various parts of intellectual creations to the original author, because you have a immutable timestamping service in the blockchain itself, and you have Swarm, which, just like Git, will let you trace the various parts of what you're sharing to whenever it was first uploaded and anchored into the blockchain. But other than that, there are a few restrictions of copyright with which I think we will have to do away with. One is artificial scarcity. So copyright is a monopoly on copying, and given the fact that copying in the digital world is basically how information moves, and we're making copies all the time, imposing this artificial scarcity is increasingly difficult, and it in many ways it does more harm than good. So I think that the fact that creators of creative content also happen to be its largest consumers, you need to to be exposed to a lot of creative content in order to be able to contribute in a meaningful and interesting way. Even if everybody pays their fair share, there's a huge additional cost of enforcing this. And given the arms race between enforcement of copyright and the kind of censorship-resistant infrastructure that we're building, and I think that the censorship resistance and the free dissemination is clearly winning that arms race, I think that this cost of enforcement that society pays as a whole is no longer justified. And another very interesting consequence of not having copyright or not relying on copyright in financing creative content is a renewed cross-pollination between various creations. So, and here I would like to make a little cultural detour. So in this talk, I won't be able to answer all questions of, how we're going to incentivize this particular type of creative content. Moreover, I think that it's entirely possible that the answer is that we cannot. And that is not necessarily a problem because, for example, since it's not possible to enslave tens of thousands of people, humanity no longer builds pyramids. And it's a valid answer, like how are we going to build pyramids without enslaving tens of thousands of people? And it might well be the case that we don't build pyramids anymore, even though pyramids are, magnificent monuments to human ingenuity and creativity. It just doesn't happen anymore. And, it might entirely be possible that making high-budget feature films with the stars earning millions of dollars will not happen. I don't know, I'm not claiming that it will not happen, but it's possible that it will not happen. But I think that how culture is financed and what kind of creative content gets created are very intimately interlinked, and there are consequences in how culture develops from how culture is funded. And for example, what copyright did, it basically killed off folk art, because folk art evolves by, imitating what other people do and, adding your little bits and pieces. But if you look at, for example, folk music or folk songs, it kind of stopped in the first half of the 20th century, because when the recording industry became dominant, copyright simply didn't leave a space for that kind of creative process. So I think that the kind of things that we're going to see are not what we have seen so far. They will, to some extent, change. So that's one way of how things have been done in the past and to a large extent are being done in the present. And the other is advertising. Funding creative content through advertising and product placement, which also has very well-known drawbacks. Namely, first of all, that is very often spam, which is simply interfering with enjoyment. When you're watching YouTube videos and they get interrupted by advertising, it's really annoying, and it's in many ways not only to the consumer but also to the creator. It kind of interferes with the intent of the creation. And also sometimes the interests of the creators and the advertisers are not aligned, and therefore certain types of content cannot be adequately funded by advertisement, or vice versa. The needs of advertisers drive culture in ways in which it is probably not in the interest of either creators or consumers. But the way we're building Be Free, we definitely don't want to preclude monetizing creation by advertising. So I'm not saying that this is bad or evil or anything. I'm just saying that it has been up to now basically the only way of freely sharing content without relying on copyright royalties. And in this presentation, I will present many other ways of funding creative content, which will relegate advertising to a particular niche where it makes most sense. And we will actually give the tools to those creators who want to fund their creations through advertising to do that. So there's a number of transitional models which exist both in centralized and decentralized implementations. And I would like to quickly go through them as well. So there's a Spotify model. Spotify still uses copyright, but does not actually critically depend on it. If you release music under some Creative Commons license, where you let other people copy it freely, you could still earn money on Spotify. So the Spotify funding model, even though it still uses copyright, is not critically dependent on it, which is a huge step forward. However, there are some concerns about its fairness. And both some consumers and some producers are unhappy with how Spotify works. And it is not that Spotify as a company is poorly run. It's the very model that consumers subscribe to the whole service, and then this revenue is proportionally distributed among the creators in proportion to, how much of it is consumed. And it is particularly unfair to some niche subcultures. So, for example, if you think of a black metal band which performs in some language other than English, it might have its loyal following, which could be perfectly adequate to fund what they do, but on Spotify, most of what they pay will go to just the most popular artists, and there will be a misalignment between how much these people pay and how much the content which the creators of the content that they consume get paid for. So that's kind of the weak spot of the Spotify model. But again, this is a funding model that we would definitely like to enable, because, as I said, it does not critically depend on the artificial scarcity created by copyright, and given the smart contract infrastructure of Ethereum, it is actually doable in a decentralized fashion. Another interesting model is Yandex Music. Unfortunately, outside of the former Soviet Union, you cannot access that website unless you have a VPN. But the way it works is that it's a music streaming service where you can put some constraints on what kind of music you want to listen to, and it just streams you music for free. And you can, and it is music, where the copyright holders are the usual publishers like Universal and those other ones. So how do they do it? Why do they allow it? So the reason they allow it is because it's analytics driven. So the payment, the way Yandex Music pays for just broadcasting this music as a streaming service is by providing analytics to the publishers. And whenever they want to try out something new, so there's a new artist that they want to test how popular it will be, or they are, for example, preparing an album release, they record 1 or 2 songs for the album, they release it on Yandex Music, and then they will get a glimpse of how popular it is, how well it does with the audience. They get lots of analytics down to like personalized preferences, like what kind of demographics listens to it and so on. And from this data, they can make decisions as to whether to fund it or not, or in which markets to release it, and so on and so forth. So it critically depends on there being some other distributions channels for which the analytics collected at Yandex Music helps. So it's not something that would stand alone. But again, this is an interesting model, which in many ways is very liberating in that there's no advertisement and no restrictions, no artificial scarcity. So we would like to enable that, but there's a huge challenge how to do analytics in a decentralized setting. And we have some ideas, but it's very much an open research topic. So those of you who are from the academia, I really encourage you to study the possibilities of doing analytics in a serverless peer-to-peer infrastructure, because I think it might be might be a huge enabler for all sorts of business models. And finally, the third of these transitional models that work in a decentralized setting is actually a decentralized example, Steemit. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's very similar to Spotify, except that it uses a blockchain, it uses its own token, and the consumers of the content can vote by these tokens to the kind of content that they approve of, and the content creators can earn in proportion to how much of these approvals they get from the audience. And also Steemit does an additional service, which is ranking. So when you're looking, as a consumer, you're looking for some type of content, then from these votes by the consumers of the creative content, Steemit will be able to aggregate some kind of a relevance score according to which you can benefit. And it immediately points to the weak point of this model, which is that it negatively discriminates against, let's call them minority cultures, which typically fork Steemit. I don't know if the Spanish-speaking world has its own Steemit, but I would not be surprised if it has. But I know for sure that there's Golos, which is the Russian language Steemit. It's a straight fork of Steemit. There's no innovation in addition to what Steemit does. And the reason they forked is because it being a much smaller culture than the English-speaking culture, their content will always be downgraded and downranked by the algorithms of Steemit, and they would never be in the top, and it would be difficult to find, so they had to fork it. But this actually points to the way forward, because on Swarm, forking is really easy. So as Aaron explained in the morning, forking a whole application and changing something, including your user, so the forking includes the user base, the data, everything, is very cheap on Swarm. So this thing that was a painful and difficult decision to fork Steemit for the Russian-speaking audience in this case, it would be the natural thing to do on a Swarm-based social media platform. So if you want to apply that business model for a particular community or a subculture, you just do it. You fork it and you hope that your fork will become a focal point for that particular content. So these are the business models that I view as transitional. And then we have some emerging alternatives which do not depend on the artificial scarcity at all and don't even use it. One is pre-funding or crowdfunding in advance. There you don't need artificial scarcity and you don't use it because it actually stands in the way. So the simplest is the typical crowdfunding model, which was pioneered by services like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, that you put a financing target, you say that I want to do this, here's the amount of money I need, here's the deadline by which you guys need to collect that amount of money, and if you collect that amount of money, then I will do it. If you don't, then everybody get their contributions back. And this is very easy to do on the blockchain in a decentralized fashion, so you don't actually need intermediaries like Kickstarter. It is very reliant on reputation, so you need to have a track record in order to successfully conduct such campaigns. And the bigger the contribution, the bigger the amount of funds that you need to collect is, the more risky it gets, both for creators and consumers. Consumers risk, of course, that even though they collect the money, the end result will be a huge disappointment. Whereas the creator is risking the fact that if they misjudge the amount of funds that they need, they will not be able to deliver. So the risks grow, and the typical consequence of this is a shift, first of all, to smaller forms of creation, and the second is to break up bigger works into smaller pieces which are crowdfunded independently. So, for example, novels are published and crowdfunded typically by chapters. You don't crowdfund the whole novel. You do it chapter by chapter. And another thing that I've never seen implemented so far, but it's very interesting, is the so-called Rational Street Performer Protocol, or RSPP. So for now, it's only a bunch of research papers. I don't think that workable implementations exist. But it kind of takes this quantitative aspect, that how many chapters people want, or how many sequels people want to a movie, or how many episodes they want in a TV series. It kind of lets the producers and the consumers to negotiate these kind of quantitative aspects in a crowdfunding fashion. So it's a very interesting thing that I definitely suggest everybody to look into. And the other one is basing funding on rankings. So the analogy is the phone-in or the SMS type voting. So followers of particular creators are willing to pay for their favorite creator to be higher in some ranking. That is validated. That has been already established, that people are willing to push their favorite artists higher in the charts. And that can be used to actually fund the creation of content. And it also solves the problem of improving search relevance. So this kind of refers back to the previous slide, that you can use paid approvals by the audience to improve search quality for that particular content. And this is my last slide. So there are some directions that have not been explored at all, and which I kind of expect to emerge, and which radically differ from what we have now. So collaborative creation. So it will be, just like in free software, I would expect some large creative works to emerge as a collaboration of various people with clear divisions of labor. Some people write the music, other people will do the animations, and so on. And we might even see things like component libraries of creative work, where people can draw upon other people's creative work because they are good at, let's say, drawing animations, but they don't want to write the music because they're not musicians. But there's a library of ready music, and there can be libraries of scripts from which they can shoot movies. We will also see forks of creative work. I think that will be actually very common. That's my expectation. If you feel strongly about Han Shot First, you can just fork Star Wars and create a version which has both the digital goodies and Han Shot First. Of course, copyright will prevent that in this particular instance, but you get the example. And you can kind of bounty the creation of missing parts. So if there's some missing part of a piece of creative content, you can post bounties for it and see it done by the community. So basically, those are the things that I wanted to talk about. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm open for the Q&A session.
Okay, is there any question? Yeah, I appreciate your presentation, and Am I right when you said that in Swarm is cheap to fork the application with users? Is it true?
Yes, it's true.
And what is the purpose of forking all the systems, all system with users? And
no. So you have a
users are know it that the rules will change.
Well, the rules don't change. They are using some application. They can continue using it. There's nothing changes. There's nothing that they have not been allowed to, they were allowed to do up till now, and from now they're not. So it's never it's never a tightening of the restrictions. But what you can do is you can look at a DApp, any DApp. It doesn't even have to be a social media DApp. You can clone it together with its user database, and you can say that here's this new app which you can, if you had a login into that app, you automatically have login into this app. So you forked a DApp together with its user database, and it's cheap. Like, you don't have to actually copy information. You just need to put in a few references here and there.
So the application was changed.
Well, the old application is still there. It's a fork. It's not a change. It's a different application.
So in that case, we have two applications after fork.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I will ask you personally. Thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, there's one.
I found some attempts at collaboration online, like writing novels, shooting movies, something together. And I wonder why they have failed.
Well, I think that the reason they have failed so far is because of coordination problems. So it's very difficult to commit to something right now online without, using the blockchain. And using the blockchain is difficult because there are no user-friendly interfaces to smart contracts. So this is one of the things that B-Free is going to address, that it will present an interface which is usable by people who are not interested in the actual inner workings of it, and it will give metaphors that are understandable by people who are into creating creative content rather than dealing with computers and distributed systems. And I think that it's the fact that there will no well-designed and no standard ways of coordinating people, that if they try to spontaneously coordinate, then very often they face difficulties because, some of them will not do what they committed to do, and so on. So it's the lack of aligned incentives and coordination that I think made some of the early attempts fail. There's a question here.
Could there be another way to replace current version? If you could prove in a way that the work that you're listening to, that you're reproducing, belongs to a certain person without having an intermediary. We have now organizations that collect fees for that. Could that model be sufficient? Could we actually need another model that would replace a copyright model?
Well, I'm not sure that I understood the question, but so let me try to answer nevertheless. So attribution on the blockchain is really easy, and you can even do it in a fine-grained way. So if you look at how Swarm works, if you take a picture from some other collection and put it into your own collection, then you can have something very similar to Git blame, where you can see that which part comes from where. So actually it's very fine-grained, And since you have timestamps and immutable records on the blockchain, and Swarm uses the blockchain as the final anchor for, like the ENS, the Ethereum name system, as the final anchor through which you find particular versions of the contract, and it has built-in versioning, attribution becomes like, it comes naturally. It's like in the fabric of Swarm. So if you want attribution, if you don't want to deliberately anonymize what you're doing, you will have it. And whether business models will emerge that make good use of it, I don't know, but I certainly hope so, and I'm going to do my best to help bring about these business models.